All right. Well, I think we're at the appointed moment. Welcome to panel A5, if I'm doing this right. We've got 4 papers and a little bit longer. This is a full hour and a half this time, but there's actually less transition time for questions. So I want to jump to it right away and also say afterwards, I'll make some, at the very end of it all, the 3:15 mark, I'll say some big brief thank yous, but then we'll move into a virtual happy hour. And so we can carry this discussion on, whatever we don't have time for now. We can keep this going until your brain wears out. So just to keep that in mind, and we'll try to keep with the panel ordering here. I don't know, I hope Bronwyn's here, but we're going to start off with Greg, whose co-authors Rick and Neil are also on board. Yes.
We're all set? Great. Well, as you can see, the name of our slides in our papers, Arts Majors as Entrepreneurs and Innovators. And besides Neil, Rick Paulsen, who I don't think is connected, is also a co-author of this paper. What we're trying to do is the following. We've, in fact, you've probably heard Neil talking about this a bit already. We've done a number of studies looking at what happens to arts majors when they graduate from college and embark upon careers. So here we're looking at basically what happens if they become entrepreneurs or innovators. I will define each of those terms in a moment. And we're going to compare them to other creative majors, such as STEM, such as social science, education, and some others, as you'll see. So again, this is probably preaching to the to everybody who's already in agreement to this. To make this sort of a quick summary, we believe that creativity creates economic growth. We believe that economic growth needs creative people. Hopefully they come out of college with creative skills. And perhaps arts majors are one of those major categories of creative people. Here are 2 quotes of exactly that type of thing this morning. Sarah gave a quote from a Professor Respreco that I may add to my list of such quotes. But the idea is that we need creative people in our digital economy, and perhaps arts majors are among the most creative. Now, we have a different data set that we work with, and let me explain why we do it. Most everybody else either makes a survey of art majors or uses an existing survey of art majors. We use the American Community Survey and find the arts majors in them. A couple of advantages to that, we think. First of all, we have a very large sample size, as you can see. And secondly, it uses a random sampling methodology. So if we do some statistical analysis with this sample, we can generalize it to the entire US population. So who are these arts majors? Well, they're not defined in the American Community Survey. They just list 150 different majors and their names and titles. We created our own set of arts majors. The majors highlighted in red are what we call core arts majors. And the reason we call them core is because they seem to be most directly connected to graduation, possibly leading to a field in the arts. Then, because we wanted to make sure we had captured the right majors, we added 4 more, which we called extended arts majors. People who never perhaps received training which isn't art specific, but could jump into fields in the arts. So in the information that follows, we'll be either using core or extended or both. Well, one of the first things that you might be interested in is what jobs do art majors hold? Now, let me move on to this graph, which is a little bit more self-explanatory. Here's core arts majors broken into different broad types of occupations. So you can see in the United States, about 23% of core arts majors actually work as artists. Now, what is an artist? We're using the 11 artist occupations that the National Endowment for the Arts defines as artistic. If we add the extended arts majors, that percentage drops down to 15. Notice that besides among professional disciplines, besides arts, education and managerial also show up, having about 25% between them both. Let me just mention that we have service and blue collar on the right. That's about 30%. For better or for worse, I like to view those service and blue collar jobs as the kind of jobs you did need a college degree to get. But a lot of college graduates have them, and not just art majors. So looking at the concept of the value of an arts major, we're trying to address, at least indirectly, the following two questions. Do the 77% of arts majors work in other fields because they can't find work as artists? Or perhaps are some or many of them uniquely qualified to work in these other fields, perhaps even more so than to work as artists? And particularly we're interested in whether or not the training and skills they receive as arts majors give them a leg up in entrepreneurial occupations and innovative and creative industries, whether they're working as artists or in some other occupation or field. So this is what we're looking at here. We'll define what entrepreneurs are, and then we'll define what innovative and creative industries are. The bottom line here is, given the fact that the American Community Survey exists and we can ask interesting questions, the best definition of entrepreneur we can come up with is to use their category self-employment as a proxy for entrepreneurial ability. And in doing so, what we do is we look at what the American Community Survey breaks occupations into. As you can see, almost 540, 23 major occupation groups. We do a test on each of these occupation categories and see whether or not they contain more than 20% self-employed people. If they make the 20% self-employment cut, they make our sample. So this collapsed the 23 occupation groups into 16, and we're basically picking them because they had at least 20% self-employed. We tried cutoffs of 15 and 25%, didn't seem to make too much difference in the results that we got. So here's the list of the occupations that made the cut, or the occupational groups that made the cut. We'll see a couple of things here. We see, for example, that core arts majors are 40% of everybody in arts and entertainment, 25% in production, 18% in computer fields, interestingly enough, and 14% in educator fields. So they do tend to be concentrated, and just sort of as a figure of reference, 4.8% of all college majors in the labor force are arts majors. So if you see a number that's greater than 4.8% in that column, they're concentrated in those particular occupations. Extended arts majors, as you can see, are far less concentrated. They're more widely distributed among these occupations. The extended arts majors, by the way, are 4.3% of all college majors in the country that are in the labor force. And one thing I should also note is arts majors in these occupations may be working as artists in arts and entertainment, they probably are, but they may be doing something else in another field, such as computer, for example. A couple of other interesting facts. Graphic design is the most prevalent arts majors working in arts, entertainment, and computer occupations. Fine arts is the most prevalent arts major in production occupations. And music is the most prevalent arts major in educator occupations. Now, the other thing that we looked at is, well, are they creative? Are they innovative? And we're using these terms more or less interchangeably here. So we did the following drilling down, so to speak. We said, okay, what industries are creative? And we decided to limit that to intellectual property industries. Intellectual property industries consist of patent industries, they consist of trademark industries, and they consist of copyright industries. Because of the unique abilities of artists to engage in work in many of the copyright industries, we limited our research just to copyright industries. We had more time and a book to write, we might add back patent and trademark. So we used the US Patent and Trademark Office definition of copyright industries, or copyright intensive industries. There are 13 of them. And if we look at the next slide, we now see the concentration of core and extended arts majors in these industries. Again, perhaps no surprises, we see that over 50% of the people working in special design services are core arts majors. We see about 30% in performing arts, movie and video production, and sound and recording production. And again, we see that the extended arts majors are spread more evenly across these same industries, with concentrations in periodicals and books and newspaper publishing. You should keep in mind that by far the largest major in the extended arts major group is the English major. So I think these concentrations make sense. Sort of an interesting thing that we noted and put in the paper as well. Before I get to that, just again, who's where. Graphic design is most prevalent in special design services. No surprise there. Music most prevalent in recording production and performing arts. And film, video, and photography most prevalent in movie and video production. This is the interesting sort of segue we did. We looked at arts majors who were in entrepreneurial occupations, and we looked at arts majors working in copyright industries at different ages. Now the American Community Survey is a snapshot of the US population every year, but we're kind of treating this as a time series. And we find that arts majors working in copyright industries, the percentage rather increases until they reach their mid-30s, and then it gradually declines. And perhaps the simplest explanation of this is most of these people are employees. They work for companies, they have careers, and once they get into their 50s, they think about retiring, they think about collecting their pensions, they think about collecting Social Security, or maybe they even change jobs. But look at the penetration of arts majors in entrepreneurial occupations. It levels off at about 40% for about 20 years. And then all of a sudden, on the age 50 and up, it goes up, and it's to 50% for people over 70. So what's our explanation here? Well, maybe two things. One is the more experience you get as an artist or working in an arts-related field, the more likely you are to start a small business, which will also make you an entrepreneur. Performing arts group, a small architectural design company, for example, or perhaps as these same people get more proficient in their careers, they, and later in life, begin to stake out careers as individual artists, visual artists, actors, musicians, for example. We haven't investigated this further, but it looked interesting enough for us to put it into the presentation. So these are the speculations. Let me just go on to the other statistical thing we do. We did some Logit regression analysis. Got it, Doug. Logit regression analysis. We've looked at whether or not being in a certain occupation makes you more likely to be in an entrepreneurial occupation, or being a central major makes you more likely to be in an entrepreneurial occupation or an innovative industry. So a positive coefficient means you're more likely. And we see that core arts majors have the largest likelihood of being in entrepreneurial occupations, and the second largest likelihood of being in an innovative industry. We also looked at the question of when they're in these industries, do they make more than the average for their major? And the answer again for core arts majors is yes, specifically so for entrepreneurial, less so for innovative industries where other majors have a higher margin. I know I'm running out of time, so let me just continue on to some implications, what we think are implications of this study. One is we see that arts majors are an important factor in entrepreneurial occupations and in creative industries. So this might argue for more investment in arts education. But we also know that arts majors don't start learning how to be an artist when they enter college. Most of them have been doing it for most of their lives. So this may also be an argument for more arts education at the elementary and secondary level. It also stresses, and I've heard this from a lot of people today, the importance of entrepreneurship education within arts higher education programs. And last, looking at the mix of creatives in these industries, it also suggests that these industries value interdisciplinarity, which is what the people supporting this argue, that an arts major is a useful addition to a creative team, not just engineers, but others as well. Thank you. Finished. Happy to take any questions.
Oh, you get 10 extra points for being early. Well done.
I thought I'd be late.
Hey, well done. Looks like Jonathan.
Yeah, I just was wondering sort of with that graph, and you saying you want to sort of look at that more, I was wondering if you guys thought about the sort of same assumptions that you're seeing with people in the copyright industries as they're reaching retirement, sort of leaving jobs, and maybe people in these in those same industries are then in retirement able to find the time and the resources to then do what they love and become self-employed and sort of explore some of these entrepreneurial opportunities.
We think maybe that's what's happening. We wish we had more hard data because we're just speculating from what we see in the survey. But it's really interesting that many of these people late in life begin to become entrepreneurs, whether they're performing artists or whether they're starting small businesses.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I'm curious also, thank you for that. I'm curious also if there's there's maybe a few other explanations as well to add on, which is in certain performing arts fields, there's a physical component to your work, which I know for dancers, for example, they often have to retire rather young. But also in certain creative fields, there's a stigma to aging. Sometimes being even in your 30s is considered old or out of touch with certain trends. I wonder if those might possibly help explain some of these patterns.
They might, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, musicians very often, not all, but some have declining skills as they get older, and actors to some degree. We just need to get more information about what's going on here, I think.
Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, I could imagine, we haven't explored this, right, but it could be the case that you are transitioning from being a performing artist to running your own production company, you're being a teacher in the arts as you age, potentially. So we could explore what entrepreneurial occupation are you across these age groupings, which we don't break down at this point.
Good point.
Before we take down the slide, I was going to ask if you could go back to, I think it's a second set of Logits, A5 in your table about the earnings. Just to clarify, can you explain again that dependent variable?
So this is within the occupational grouping or innovative industry, are your earnings above the average? So this would be saying that you are majoring in the core arts increases your likelihood of having above average earning, conditional on occupation by 4.7%.
Okay, so if you're one of these, core arts majors, I don't know, let's say you're a music major and you're in an entrepreneurial occupation, you're more likely to be earning above average for those people in your entrepreneurial occupation. Yeah,
so I'd say this is suggesting that training in the core arts increases your success within these occupations, right? Yeah. So like the prior slide would say, you're more likely to work in that occupation. This slide is saying, not only are you more likely to work there, but you're achieving greater success, at least in terms of earnings.
Even if that occupation isn't all that artsy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What's interesting about this, and I didn't say this, but our research clearly tells us that arts majors don't earn much money in the labor force compared to other creative majors as a whole. But maybe there are special niches where they can do better.
Yeah. Amy. False start.
I was curious the kind of conversation you all had and the analysis on that point about how low arts earnings are. For example, relating the earnings to the living wage in different areas. Because you may find that there are distortions based on people who are independently wealthy who can stick it out a long time or something like that.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback before you guys answer.
Go ahead.
Because our work on switching in and out of freelancing shows a huge role of not independent wealth necessarily, but household income as
Yeah,
opposed to
exactly. Non-solo worker access to income or capital. Yeah. Or just risk, like a safety net.
Well, one thing that this is a conclusion from a study that Neil and I did a long time ago. We discovered that artists, not art majors, but artists, had the wealthiest spouses of many different occupations. It's as if that this was their personal subsidy that enabled them to pursue artistic careers in some cases.
I aspire to this personally.
I recently learned that Vermeer had 11 children and died with 3 years of bread debt, even having been a recipient of family wealth. So I think it's actually a pretty non-trivial question. And $30,000 is the 16,000 pounds or $30,000 or the rough artist salary estimate. So
one thing I should say here, these are college grads, so that the arts majors' earnings, going by individual major, every one of them is below the average earnings of a college grad, but they're probably not poverty level very often. There are artists with 8th grade, 10th grade educations who often do less well, in part because their alternatives are less.
Well, while I wait for another question to come in, I'm wondering, as I look at this table, what it would look like for the arts major effect on non-entrepreneurial occupations.
We haven't looked at that.
I mean, it's kind of funny. They're better than the average entrepreneur,
right?
But worse than the average non-entrepreneur.
Remembering a lot of those artist occupations are entrepreneurial, so they wind up being in this group. You know, whether they're working as artists or using their skills in a related type of job.
So they would outperform me as far as being a musician goes. That makes sense. I would have become a musician.
Quick question. I'm sorry if I forgot how to raise my hand. This survey, the American Community Survey, asks how much money you made last week. Is that, or what you did for work last week? Or are there questions about just more broadly, are you an artist?
Well, with respect to earnings, they ask, what did you make last year?
Right.
Okay.
And one thing that I should mention, it's not the arts major is definite, okay? But let's say you're an actor. The survey asks you, what was your chief job last week? So if you happen to be unemployed as an actor that week, you're classified as an Uber driver, even though your dream is to be a successful actor. But the arts majors are definite because that's a past event. So you're confident about how they're classified. But whether they're in, let's say, the arts occupation will be depending upon whether or not they're actually being an artist in the year that in the week that the survey is undertaken.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Alex, the ACS does not ask a multiple job holding question, so we have no information about that. It's truly unfortunate, but
yeah.
Thank you.
Great. All right, I think we're going to jump over. If we have time, we'll come back to more of this, but I'm going to try to set Bronwyn up for our next talk. I should have given you co-host privileges there, Bronwyn.
Okay.
Hey, all right.
Hi. Oh, this is not very good video. Hi everyone. I'm calling from Australia and it's a crazy time difference, so please excuse me if I seem a bit incoherent. And in preparing for that, I've made a video for my presentation, so I'll try and run that, but if it doesn't work, well then I'll resort to a more traditional presentation. So just let me share my screen now.
You might be entitled to do this and then just go to bed while it runs.
Yeah. Is that working?
I think so.
Oh, good.
Hi everyone, my name's Bronwyn Coate. I'm from RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia.
I'm delighted to be sharing with you today research that I've been involved in along with Pia Arenius, Swee Hoon Chuah, and Rob Hoffman. Our research investigates the psychological similarities between artists and entrepreneurs. We explore this drawing on the principles from individual difference psychology. We compare artists and entrepreneurs with each other and also with respect to another occupational group comprised of professional workers. By including individuals from these different occupational groups of interest within the same study, we are able to test and make direct comparison to uncover evidence of similarity and difference. Before I explain any further how we conducted the research and what we found, I'd first like to reflect on the all-important question of why. Why should we care? And what can be gained from understanding the psychological similarities between artists and entrepreneurs? In the case of this research, we have two important aims. The first one, that will be most obvious, has to do with better understanding what makes the artist tick, so to speak. We do this at a psychological level. And the reason this is important is because so far, the idea of the artist as an entrepreneur or artrepreneur has arisen largely due to the similar type of work environments faced by both artists and entrepreneurs. For instance, artists may be perceived as being entrepreneurial simply as a result of their necessity to pursue self-employment. But does being self-employed alone make an artist entrepreneurial? Can artists not be entrepreneurial in other ways and contribute to innovation? In this research, we are able to test whether what is shared between artists and entrepreneurs beyond their similar work circumstances extends to their psychology as well. I'll now address some of the specifics about how we conducted the research. As I mentioned earlier, this is an exploratory study. We bring together artists, entrepreneurs, and a third group comprised of professional workers. These three groups are examined within the same quasi-economic experiment, undertaking identical tests and completing the same survey questionnaire. A benefit of this design is that it allows us to directly compare the three occupational groups. To our knowledge, we are the first study to bring artists and entrepreneurs into the same experimental design. This means that we can directly compare artists and entrepreneurs both with respect to each other and also in relation to a third group based on the professional workers. As an exploratory study, we cover a wide range of psychological dimensions in order to get an overview of how artists and entrepreneurs compare in broad terms. The areas we explore fit within a typology from individual difference psychology. Specifically, we selected 8 key dimensions of individual difference that we believe are of interest. Our selection of these dimensions was based on our reading of relevant literature. We firstly look at the fundamental dimension of human personality. We then move on to discuss the key trait most often associated with becoming an artist or entrepreneur, that is, intrinsic motivation. From here, we next address risk-taking and creativity as critical characteristics that are associated with performing artistry and entrepreneurship. Finally, we also consider a further 4 social and affective traits that previous research has linked to risk and creativity that we also bring into our analysis. These additional traits include social value orientation, self-efficacy, overconfidence, and also inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, or ADHD. Now that you have a clearer sense of the specific psychological dimensions that the research will be testing between the groups, let me tell you a little bit more about the research design. Our study was conducted in the purpose-built Business Behavioural Lab at RMIT. The quasi-economic experiment we ran involved experimental tasks and also a questionnaire. In all, it took participants around 90 minutes to complete. Participants were paid for both their time and also for their responses to the incentivised task activities. In total, we had 216 participants in the research. including 93 artists, 76 entrepreneurs, and 37 professionals. The three groups were similar in terms of key demographic variables. The average participant age was 36 years, 50% were female, 45% had a bachelor's degree, and 16% came from a non-English speaking background. It's now time for me to share the results. I'll show these on each of the 8 dimensions investigated. When I show the results on screen, I'm just presenting the average participant scores and post hoc analysis. The other results, including regression analysis and correlations, can be found in the paper. So please check these out if you'd like to delve a little deeper into our findings from the experiment. Starting with personality. Based on our reading, which pointed to contradictions in the popular stereotypes of both artists and entrepreneurs, we hypothesized that there would be few personality differences between groups, and if there were, that these would be small. To measure personality, we used the Hexico Personality Inventory based on 60 questions that identifies 6 distinct aspects of personality. From the analysis of the Hexico responses, we find no differences between groups for honesty, humility, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. However, on the other 3 aspects of personality, differences did emerge. For emotionality, the results were significant, with artists scoring much higher compared to professional workers and especially compared to the entrepreneurs. In terms of extroversion, results were also significant, but again, as with emotionality, showed a difference between artists and entrepreneurs, with the entrepreneurs being the most extroverted of the 3 groups and the artists the least. And finally, the results on openness to experience showed that the artists are most open to take on new experience, followed by the entrepreneurs. Next, we looked at intrinsic motivation. Based on our reading, we found evidence from other studies supporting that both artists and entrepreneurs are highly intrinsically motivated and driven in their pursuits. We hypothesized that artists and entrepreneurs would both be more task-orientated than professional workers. From psychology, learning goal orientation has been used to measure intrinsic motivation. This relates to an individual's motivation to self-develop through mastery and the acquisition of new skills. To measure intrinsic motivation, we use survey questions to capture learning goal orientation. On this measure, we found significant differences, with artists scoring the highest, followed by entrepreneurs. The results were confirmed by both post hoc and regression analysis. Next is risk preference. Based on our reading, and also in light of anecdotal observation, we hypothesized that artists and entrepreneurs would demonstrate higher risk-taking preferences compared to the professional workers. For this, we used 2 tests. The first was based on perceived risk-taking and was elicited from participants' response to self-report on this. We found that entrepreneurs and artists reported similar in terms of seeing themselves to be more risk-taking compared to the professional workers. The second part involved observed risk behaviour from participation in the balloon analogue risk task, which was incentivised. In this, participants receive higher payment the more they inflate a virtual balloon that can burst at any time. For this, the entrepreneurs proved to be significantly more risk-taking compared to the other groups. So overall, the evidence was mixed for artists, but certainly revealed entrepreneurs accurately perceived themselves to be more risk-taking. Next, we examined creativity. Again, this is another hallmark characteristic associated with both artists and entrepreneurs. So for this, we hypothesized that both would be similar in terms of showing evidence of higher creativity compared to professional workers. We measured creativity using a divergent thinking task adapted from the Torrance test for creative thinking. This had 2 parts. In the first part, participants had 2 minutes to draw as many conceptually different objects as possible that incorporated a simple geometric form, which in this case was 2 circles. Participants were paid for each unique object. The second part of the test involved showing participants an everyday object. In this case, it was a pencil. and the participants then had 2 minutes to come up with as many unique and unusual ways a pencil could be used, for instance as a chopstick. They were paid for each unique use that they identified. For the creativity test, artists scored significantly higher than entrepreneurs, who were followed by the professionals. Post hoc tests support that artists are significantly different from the other groups in terms of their higher creativity. Moving on now to social value orientation. This measures a person's preference for a particular distribution of outcomes between themselves and others. Based on our reading of the literature, where evidence was mixed, we hypothesised that no significant difference would exist between the three groups. To measure social value orientation, we used a test where participants choose alternative allocations between themselves and another unknown person. This is used to uncover whether a person is pro-social, individualistic, or competitive. Unlike what we had hypothesised, the responses to this differed markedly across the three groups. The results of the Logit regression confirmed that most artists are pro-social compared to the other groups. There is also a significantly greater likelihood for entrepreneurs being individualistic compared to the other groups. And while few participants were deemed to be competitive, if they were, then they were far more likely to be entrepreneurs. Next, we measured self-efficacy. This relates to an individual's belief in their capabilities to take the steps necessary to produce desired outcomes. Based on our reading, we hypothesised that artists and entrepreneurs wouldn't differ much from each other but would score higher than the professional workers. To measure this, a suite of survey questions was included based on measures used in psychology that asked things like the participants' belief in their ability to bounce back from failure. Here, the entrepreneurs scored significantly higher than the other two groups, which were similar. We then come to overconfidence. For this, we hypothesised that entrepreneurs would score highest. Again, this was based on our readings of the literature. To measure overconfidence, we use a simple better-than-average approach that asked, out of every 10 participants doing this experiment, how many do you think will earn more money from their participation compared to you? Unlike what we had expected, there was no significant differences between the groups. Last but not least, we looked at ADHD. Based on our reading, this has been linked to highly creative individuals, which led us to hypothesise that artists and entrepreneurs would score higher for ADHD compared to professional workers. For this, we used the Adult ADHD Screening Test, which is based on a series of questions to measure ADHD. As for the results, there were some significant differences here as well, with the artists scoring highest and the professional workers the lowest. Okay, so we're at the end. There's been a lot squished into this presentation, but if you're interested to learn more, please email me, read the paper, get in touch, follow me on Twitter. Anyway, thanks for watching.
Okay, thank you.
Well, it was wonderful, and I appreciate the hard work managing to get through the technical difficulties. Let's try to sneak in one question here before we move on, and hopefully we can all circle back. Anyone want to give a quick question? And if not, we can save the time and move and circle back at the end of this session as well. Okay, Bronwyn, thank you. And we'll see if people have a question at the end. I'm going to start on my end here. I might skip through some things to get going faster. So for those of you who saw my work in the previous panel, this is using the same data set, just from a very different perspective. Here I'm thinking about this less from the perspective of the individual entrepreneur moving and more from the perspective of a city. And as they compete with each other to attract some of these creative types. So this model is basically thinking of this as a brain drain or brain gain perspective from the city's perspective. We'll acknowledge the NEA again for their support in all of this and note that they didn't have anything to do with it. In terms of contributions here, we're looking at a test of different forces attracting people to cities, whether it's more of a homophily hypothesis that people are drawn to similar people, probably to get those learning spillovers or productivity spillovers, whether it's market access hypotheses or amenities driving migration. And what we end up showing is that having Kickstarter projects of your own type does lead to migration, except for in publishing and in art-related, art, specific the art field in Kickstarter categories. And only jobs are attracting the musicians. Creative class leads to more dynamic population changes. It doesn't actually help with more net migration, however. Market size, actually, I'll do this one, speed this up. Market size is a strange result here, and that for some versions, it's a concave relationship that peaks at 1 to 3 million people per metro area. But in general, it actually is negatively related to net migration. These cloud entrepreneurs moving to smaller regions, if population. And amenities were interesting how they mattered. Climate matters for some of the arts-related fields, but didn't matter for those in technology and those in music and video. Homophily matters in a very specific way, consistent with what we did at the micro level. There's a basis for all of this work on sort of the intersection of cloud platform, depth of distance, internet-related work, and these new geography of jobs literature where cities are competing with each other to get these high-skilled workers. I'm going to skip through this stuff in the interest of time, but I will say if we think of breaking down advantages to clustering in urban areas into 3 big categories of homophily and clustering with similar workers in order to gain productivity and learning advantages, thicker markets and better matches for either labor or output sales or consumptive amenities, people moving to better weather and the like. Across these 3 hypotheses, we want to ask the question about, well, how would this apply to people who are working in the platform economy? Why move at all if you're selling your wares in the cloud? You could be anywhere. So how much do these things matter? And what we might see that it matters just as much if these creators are clustering. It's not clear how these jobs spill over, but they might well spill over as well. In terms of market size, people may still be moving to bigger or better, wealthier crowds. Entities may or may not matter as much, given that you're a rather footloose producer. So for this paper, we're using that same scraped Kickstarter data set, the first 7 years of Kickstarter, 250,000 projects, aggregated everything up to the CBSA level across 940 metropolitan and micropolitan areas in the US, and we're summing up the total amount of dollars pledged for Kickstarter projects in that area, the number of creators who've invented projects, started projects in those areas, the number of projects themselves, and then we do them all broken down by the 15 main Kickstarter categories, and then a couple other repackagings of these categories. And then we look at these repeat creators only those in this case who've moved between CBSAs, between their projects. So within CBSA, a local move, we're not going to count those as from a city. We're only looking at moving from one metro or micro area to another. And so we take the net migration, the amount moving in versus the amount moving out, and that's essentially our dependent variable here. And we'll do net migration of all Kickstarters and then break it down by net migration of those in theater, those in dance, those in any of these subcategories or categories. The model for this is basic OLS, testing 3 big sections of hypotheses, whether it's the homophily one, where we are looking at people, whether they move based on the amount of Kickstarter or based on the net migration into an area being by the amount of other Kickstarter activity, the amount of other Kickstarter in the same category as the movers, percent of the population in the metro or micro area in the creative class, and then job mix aligning with the particular subgroup of migration. We've got a set of market size variables and market quality or wealth and education, and then some amenity variables. And in all of this, we're excluding the movers themselves from the CBSA level aggregate measures of Kickstarter activity, which for the big cities is a very marginal or non-existent trivial effect. But for some of these smaller areas, 1 or 2 Kickstarters is all they have. So if you counted the movers, that could actually be the entirety of their Kickstarter activity. So we exclude them. But that brings me to an issue in terms of the econometrics of all of this, where the distribution is terribly zero inflated. Over half of the CBSAs over the 7 years have a net migration of 0. And in most cases, that's because they had nobody coming. And in most of those cases, it's because they have no Kickstarter activity at all. Some of them had Kickstarter activity that just didn't move in or out. And then some of them, like Los Angeles, had exactly a net zero, net migration of 0, where exactly as many Kickstarters left LA as came into LA. So to deal with this huge data spike at 0, we end up estimating this as a finite mixture model, where we essentially have one model explaining the mass distribution at 0, and we use the same variables to explain that, more or less, as those we use to explain conditional on not being 0 net migration. What explains why you either had a lot of people coming in on net or a lot of people leaving on net. To give you an example of this, across all 942 CBSAs, generally the net migration as expected would be 0. There's 300,000 people in the average CBSA. 6% of them are coastal CBSAs, almost a third of the eastern part of the US. And if we look at just the ones that had non-zero net migration, we can see again, on average, their net migration is 0, but they have a little bit more creative class, they're a little bit larger, a little bit wealthier, a little bit more educated, a little bit more eastern, and so on. To give you what I think is more interesting, this is the top and the bottom 15 or so CBSAs on the list of net migration. So San Francisco is the biggest winner here, adding 54 net in-migrating Kickstarters over the course of these 7 years. So you see San Francisco, Nashville, Seattle at the top of the list, things you might expect. But then on the bottom of the list, there's Boston and Austin and San Diego, things that you might not have expected to be down at the bottom. And if I start coming up with pairs, it's an interesting thing to have to explain San Francisco and Boston being on opposite ends of this. Or Kansas City and Indianapolis, why they're on opposite ends of the distribution. Interesting questions. Also, the biggest losers aren't small towns generally. They can be rather large, just as the biggest winners are big cities, but not necessarily just size. In LA aren't on there. And Rochester's doing pretty well. Same with Asheville. So this first stage of the model to predict which are the areas that had 0 net migration, we see homophily matters. So if you have fewer Kickstarter projects, you tended to have no net migration. If you had fewer creative class, you had no net migration. Market size, population didn't matter too much. Interestingly, wealthier CBSAs tended to have no net migration for many of the arts sectors, arts categories, and amenities had very little to say, and were generally not predictive about which CBSAs were static. But if we think overall for Kickstarter projects, which CBSAs were more attractive to migrating Kickstarters? Well, it was the CBSAs that had more Kickstarter projects. And it was not those that had more creative class. It was not bigger cities. In fact, the bigger CBSAs in terms of population tended to have less this net migration. And amenities mattered in that people seem to be moving out west. They tend to be moving to non-coastal CBSAs. And for some reason, they're moving towards more humid areas. That one I can't explain. If we break it down by category, here I'm giving 4 different categories results. One is fine arts, which is actually the combination of the art, the dance, and the theater categories. One is all arts, which includes things like music and film in addition to fine arts, and it includes publishing and craft and food and fashion and design. And then there's the music and the film categories separated. So we can see that for fine arts, music, and film, all 3 were positively associated with having more Kickstarter projects of that type tended to lead to more net migration. So to highlight some, across arts really broadly defined, having broadly defined Kickstarter projects wasn't all that attractive. It really takes the more narrow category to attract the more narrow type of migration. Again, as we saw in my previous panel, the cities that had a higher concentration of jobs in the music industry tended to attract more net migration of music creators. There's generally a big negative effect of the largest cities. These things tended to not have positive net migration. There's a big strong pull to the West, and for at least the fine arts, a move out of the east of the US. And for some reason, artists tend to like what I think many would consider to be bad weather. The bad weather cities are the ones that have the highest in-migration or net migration of arts Kickstarter projects. They're attracted to colder winters, hotter summers, and more humidity. So overall, we see for the Homophily story, these Kickstarters are attracted to regions that are strong in their own type of Kickstarter projects and not into Kickstarter projects overall. I think they're actually dissuaded from moving to generally Kickstarter active places. They want specific Kickstarter active places. Population has a negative effect except for locally based projects like food and theater, except for fine arts and for film, but for each of those at the 1 million, 2 million, and 4 million marks respectively, the effective population still becomes negative on net migration. And the artsy people are attracted to bad weather out west. Although music and film don't seem to be influenced at all by climate. They can play anywhere in terms of what the CBSAs that are attracting them. So in the end, we've got some puzzling tales on the distribution here where you've got some interesting pairs between positive and negative net migration that one might not have expected or be able to explain so easily why San Diego's on one side of the ledger and Detroit's on the other. We see a westward trend. We see that Kickstarter creators are not drawn to big populations. They're not going after the crowd despite being people who are ostensibly active in crowdfunding. And they tend not to follow usual factors of things like creative class, going to wealthier or more educated markets, coastal, nice climate. These aren't the things that are attracting this group. A big story out of all this is heterogeneity across the different types of creators matters a lot. This is really consistent with a paper I had come out earlier this year on the geographic clustering across all types of Kickstarter projects. But when we look at those who are migrating as a subsample, they're very consistent with people moving towards people like them. I think a big takeaway of this is there's not going to be a single sort of silver bullet for policy if you're trying to do things to attract a creative class to a particular CBSA, to a particular metro area. In general, you're going to have to build communities of that particular type that you're trying to get. And it's not necessarily going to be communities around people working in that sector, musicians aside. It's actually going to be around people who are actually working in the cloud and in these crowdfunding venues to be able to do that. And then if you can make the weather worse, you might get more artists moving in, probably because they can't afford San Diego. And with that, I will stop and open it up for a few comments before we move on to hear from Amy. Go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was really, really interesting. I was wondering, I noticed there are some college towns in the net migration out, and I was wondering if there's any data about age of students or any ability to look at it over 4 years. I mean, theoretically, people would be replaced by other students. Was there more information on that?
No, that's one of the we want to go after. And actually, we've got a variable we're going to bring in that's specifically looking at art schools. I think what Alex would have referred to as focus schools before. So we're going to apply that and see if that can help explain things. But one of my first hypotheses looking at this would be that the net losers might be places with big higher ed components. So students or recent grads as their first projects are in that town, but then they all leave, go home, go get real jobs somewhere else, and then their second projects are elsewhere. So Boston looks like a big net loser because it's actually exporting these people after they graduate. And I think that's definitely something, that's one of our best stories that we have. We just haven't formally tested it yet.
I wanted to put an inferior good story on it, but I've still been resisting doing that. But it's really, just the idea that a college town is an inferior good to an industry town, not necessarily true, but I was noticing. That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it could flip things on its head, where often we think if you're trying to attract these people, that means there's a ton of strength, but it might also be the place where people go to die. So Detroit, it could be this black hole that you move to Detroit and you can't ever get out again.
Well, also Detroit, you might not get out because you might have bought property at a very advantageously low price. I think it'd also be interesting to know the data of Kickstarter total projects over time, the trend line, just relative to what you're seeing. Like, was it really hot in 2012, but not in 2016, for example?
Well, when we went into this, we wanted to do it as a panel and do a time series for it. The problem is, San Francisco gained 54, but the distribution gets down to 3s and 4s and 2s and 1s really quickly. And that's the cumulative over a 7. If you start doing this year by year, almost places in a given year are zeros. And end up making the distribution, I think we're straining the data a little too much to really get that time. Moving to the city before or after all of those projects came in. And so we don't have a problem with doing this flat as a cross section. I got a thumbs up from Alex on doing the special schools. Any other questions? Maybe we'll sneak one more in if there is one. Do this while I'm giving co-host privileges. Go ahead, Greg.
Just wondering, when you're talking sort of ironically about people being attracted to bad weather and non-coastal, is this really a cost of living phenomenon that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think my San Diego joke, right? Is it they're relying on Kickstarter as a revenue source, which as a general rule is not go around feeding the family. There's just much money there. So these may be particularly scrounging kind of artists that aren't able to move to the high income places or the really good weather places. Absolutely. And I think we need to push more on cost of living is a little tricky in part when we aggregate it all to the CBSA level, because we're going to be mixing downtown with all the suburban counties for some of these big metros. And so the within CBSA variation in cost of living will be wiped out. And it probably is dominant in explaining a lot of this. Within CBSA, climate variation doesn't matter as much, but it will for cost of living. So it's something to work on. Thank you. All right, I'm going to shut up and pass the baton or the microphone over to Amy for our fourth and final paper of arguably the entire Leveraging Creativity workshop. So go ahead, Amy. Thank you.
All right, well, I've unmuted myself. That's always a start. Thank you very much, and thanks for the valiant timekeeping as well. Thank you for the invitation to present, and very excited to receive comments and suggestions for the paper, so I will try very hard to stay on time. I started out looking at incubators and taxonomies of incubators. And then I actually zeroed in on a different question. I think there's some great work that's already been done, taxonomies of incubators. So what I started looking at is really mispricing of risk and the way that certain really core finance and economic theory operates in relation to some artist-run incubator projects. And I'll come back to Titus Kaphar and his organization at the end, which is why I put his cover from Time up, also just as an acknowledgement of solidarity with the current time and the entire history of the United States, of course. So I started with an organization called Art Built, which is based at the Brooklyn Army Terminal. And it was co-founded by Esther Robinson and Guy Buckles. And Esther basically started this as an art project, an activist art project. One day I woke up and realized that everything I love about New York City was possibly endangered. No one would give me money to fix it. And then I lost my temper and did it myself. We realized they didn't have a clear understanding of the value of arts as an actual business enterprise. So what I want to do is I want to just kind of give away the whole ball game and give you an overview of the paper and then go through the 3 different cases and talk about how these interventions come up in the 3 cases, and then again save some time for questions and comments. So there are these 3 core limitations: risk, how to tell a story of risk, and then some really basic kind of market like Markowitz portfolio risk pieces on the rates, the interest rates people are being offered, scale, limited economies of scale in arts organizations, measurement is kind of best used for whom. And here we get into a lot of different questions of method, contingent evaluation methods, economic development methods. Doug, I'm baiting you. We've had a conversation about this. And the proposals I have are really interventions into these theoretical problems. One is a form of balance sheet philanthropy, which I'll say more about later. This is foundations lending their balance sheets so that organizations can get lower lending rates. You can also imagine organizations like hedge funds that engage in kind of credit wrapper reinsurance activities. If there were a change in the tax code where they could do this philanthropically, that would be very interesting. And then how to build cooperative structures and economies of scope that allow arts organizations to take advantage where they can, where scale is not possible. Different sorts of story-driven metrics in cases where change is not incremental but transformational, and then using shared equity systems where it's very difficult to measure output, so why not just assign property rights in a Coasian sense and then allow people to have a share of it if it appreciates in value. The 3 cases I'm going to cover today are Art Built, which is in Brooklyn, Rec Philly in Philadelphia, and Next Haven in New Haven. I want to be clear, what I'm saying about Next Haven is speculative. I have interviewed and worked with all 3 of these organizations, but I'm using them as a hypothetical for some of the fractional equity ideas, which they're aware of, but they're not currently developing. I don't want to misconstrue that. A lot of important literature, some of which, is like the classics of finance and economics, but I also have drawn heavily on Linda Essig's Taxonomy of Incubators from 2014, Rushton's work on hybrid organizations. These are not legally hybrid organizations, but they are hybrid in their practice, nonprofits with economic development aims, for example. And then Joanna and Doug have done some really interesting work on freelancers, and this comes up as part of the economy of scope question in the Rec Philly case. I wanted to be able to show pictures because I think it's important to get a sense of what these projects look like and their specificity. Art Built is a 50,000 square foot project in the Brooklyn Army Terminal, which is in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, as you can see on the water. The Brooklyn Army Terminal was built in 1919. Everything that went to US forces in World War II, including Elvis Presley and other actual US forces, went through the Brooklyn Army Terminal. It looks like the set of a science fiction movie that I haven't seen, but I bet someone here has. It's just massive in scale. It's a 4 million square foot building. It has a train down the middle. It's very well outfitted for artist workspace because it has huge freight elevators, 24-hour access. It's designed by Cass Gilbert, who is better known for the Woolworth building. At the time, it was one of the largest concrete slab construction projects in the world. It is owned by the New York City Economic Development Corporation, which means that they rent it out at below market rates. So when Esther, she was part of the original Creative Capital team, she founded Art Home and a mobile studio venture, and she partnered with Guy Buckles, who was a co-founder of the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts. They put in their own personal capital, and then they went and got a $1.3 million loan from LISC, the community development organization, at a 3.5% rate. If you see the red circle on the slide, that's their space. 50,000 square feet is basically as large as you can have of a space of this kind. Beyond that, you can't imagine forms of community. It becomes a bit of a bus station. But could you imagine a lot of different 50,000 square foot organizations coming together? The reason I say that is that they were quite intentional that they were not building a WeWork. They did not want people to price in as wanting a co-working space. It's intentionally a bit unfinished. But one of the main benefits that they have given their tenants is stability or security or a lack of volatility. Most people were in contingent leases that expired after a year or two, and their personal and creative lives were heavily affected. They couldn't sign mortgages, they didn't know where their kids were going to school, and now they have a 10-year lease with a 5-year extension. And when Esther was telling the story to get the funding for the project, one of her main risk metrics was vacancy. This does not pertain during the COVID era, but she made the argument not that there was good collateral or that there is good job per square foot creation, but that it would never be empty because there would always be demand for substantially below market rents. I can say more about what they've been doing during coronavirus if there are questions. So if we think about this, we apply really basic kind of finance theory. I think that they operate at a scale beyond which they would be out of step with COSA's basic definition of the firm as a set of contracts. They are not able to access scale, as described by many people, including Alfred Chandler, this decrease in the per unit cost with an increase in production, and they're not able to capture their risk return profile very well. They create a lot of value that's very hard to measure. And I think it would be hard to measure even with a contingent valuation method. They're the home of the last guitar maker in New York City. So what they're trying to do, and someone mentioned this in the program yesterday, is they're part of the Kickstarter motto, excuse my French, fuck the monoculture, which is to say they're trying to go for specificity and variety, and they are not measurable on a scale of Bed Bath & Beyond. And so what they're trying to do is to build a system that is sustainable. And to me, if we start to look at some of this kind of balance sheet philanthropy, we can imagine they're getting cheaper rates. At the same time that Art Built was going up, Industry City had, which is another comparable 5 or 6 million square foot space, not so far from where Art Built is housed. The developers received a Bank of China loan for a $200 million mortgage as opposed to a $1.3 million mortgage at closer to a 2% rate. So would it be possible for the Joan Mitchell Foundation to support Esther and Guy by guaranteeing their loan effectively so that they could get a lower interest rate? So those are the sorts of interventions that I'm starting to model in this work. The second case is Rec Philly, which is the main founder of Rec Philly is Will Toms, who's in the middle of the picture. Will had this space a long time ago, very informally, and in the last year, he built with David Silver, his co-founder, built a venue in a shopping mall. So some people liken Rec Philly to WeWork, but I think it's actually quite different. They describe it as a gym membership for creative people. They have a storefront where they sell on consignment things that are made by the Rec Philly members, and they skew more toward music and recording than visual art. They have a lot of spaces for music recording, podcast studios. People pay between $50 and $150 a month to be members, and it operates on a voucher system where you have the ability to, voucher into use of the rooms based on your membership level. Their core metric is people who can stop working day jobs to support themselves full-time on a freelance basis. That is the main thing they're trying to do. So I think they're trying to create a force for support for creative workers. And to me, this is an economy of scope project that extends to a franchise expansion in other cities. And again, these are pre-coronavirus aspirations of the organization. And then also the possibility that Rec Philly functions as a brand, so that they function almost like a constellation proxy of a Cozian firm, so that freelancers can have access to a centralized way that they would be a magnet for people who are advertising freelance work. They would advertise Direct Philly if they had a trusted brand of community. So here I think that this sort of economy of scope approach is interesting. And Rec Philly has some other very, I think, inventive parts of their business model, including a Live Nation partnership and a stage. So they're already doing this kind of branded content, co-branded content. And this dovetails a little with the earlier paper on virtual screening by movie theaters in the time of Corona. I should say Art Built is a 501c3, Rec Philly is venture funded privately. And the third case is Next Haven, which is an artist residency program in New Haven, Connecticut, which is founded by Titus Kaffar, the artist on the right in the wavy striped jumper, and his partner on the business side. He has two different partners, but this is Jason Price, who actually used to work in a private equity sense on a franchise of gyms, membership gyms. And this is an intervention into an underserved community in New Haven, the Dixwell neighborhood. I don't know if everyone's familiar with Titus's work or not. He won a MacArthur Fellowship last year. He has a sort of, kind of starry credentialized background as an artist, which he referenced in a piece of writing that he did to go with the Time magazine cover. Thank you, Doug. Last week, sort of saying this picture of the Black mother with the no child, that he's not protected by any of those credentials. So what I think is interesting about Next Haven is that they're creating shared value. They are philanthropically funded. They have a really good foundation funding, including from Mellon. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to revitalize that neighborhood and create structural change in who is represented in the arts and in art markets. So what I would propose as an intervention here, and I think they're quite open to it but not committed to it, is to apply research that I've done otherwise on artists retaining fractional equity in their work. This is an artist named Vaughn. This is Vaughn's work at an art fair at the Armory Show. You can imagine many, many different structural scenarios in which artists own 90% of their work and have donated 10% equity to Next Haven, and that money then goes into funding Next Haven in perpetuity, or they could give 8% to Next Haven and 2% to a community development fund, or Next Haven could collect the work and then give retained equity to the artist, so that in these cases where markets are not good at recognizing the price of a work of art at the time, thank you, the work is sold, I'm looking at the time, they can own property rights in the work, so that those property rights can move over time as markets come to recognize the underlying value. So I think that what I want to say ultimately is that these are not market motivated organizations, but they're deeply creative artist interventions into using market structures to support creativity and artistic work. I see them being limited in a couple of conceptual ways with regard to scale and risk, and wanted to propose some speculative suggestions for how to remedy that, in some ways using tools of markets themselves, and in other ways using especially property rights and risk sharing, and in other ways finding economies of scope through cooperative structures. I think technologies such as blockchain make this easier to do than before. I intend this conceptual framework to be the basis of empirical research that probably starts out in a sociological mode of survey and ethnographic interview, but that can also be studied more quantitatively as these organizations and their peers develop longer track records of financials to analyze. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I love it. It's a great tie-in very clearly with yesterday's symposium on a number of levels, but I also love it that I didn't want to look at any more regressions. After I saw my own, I was done for the day. So thank you for the variety in that regard also.
And I'm sorry, I just want to say I am, Angie Kim, I think, is in the chat from the Center for Cultural Innovation in Los Angeles, and they've been doing some amazing work in these areas with their Ambitious initiative, which everyone should check out.
Yes, yes. All right, so comments and questions, including from the CCI folks. Go ahead and try to raise your virtual hand. Mel's waving his actual hands. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is just really an observation and an expression of appreciation. Economics of scale has been much, of course, exploited and discussed by cultural economists over the years. But scope economies have not gotten nearly as much attention, both at the micro level and then more aggregated approaches. And I wanted to just reinforce your exploration of that and to urge you to continue checking that out. My suspicion is that case studies of this nature are where we will most likely, and comparative case studies is where we'll uncover the beneficial effects of utilizing the economies of scope.
Thanks, Mel.
Thank you very much. And just to say, I so warmly welcome any literature suggestions in case there's anything that I've missed or that is a particular favorite study.
Time for one more question? Comments? If not, I'm going to take the time to say thank you to our other paper presenters and everyone for sticking through to the end of this and participating in this. But thank you to Greg and his co-authors. Thank you to Bronwyn down under. Thank you to Amy. Well done, everyone. Let's have a nice round of applause for all of our presenters, please.